Hi, my name is Emily. I've done a few videos. I'm not really all that confident when I do videos, but I try to speak clearly, and I also try to speak with messages. I try to portray what it's like actually to be male to female transgender and what that process is like. Um, right now, the only treatments that I've been doing is hormone replacement therapy, which I started a year ago in June. So I'm a year on estradiol, and I also take an anti-androgen, spironolactone. So I know a lot of trans girls know the two medications taken together, spironolactone and estradiol, are usually for the chemical aspect of gender change. Um, I knew from an early age, when I was roughly 4 years old, wearing girls' clothes and gravitating towards that. And I knew in my heart that I was a girl, but I couldn't really speak to anybody about it. It was very difficult for me, and I tried to understand the situation. I tried to find some understanding of it. And, I was just a little kid, and I knew something wasn't right. The problem was I was growing up in the early 60s. I was born in 1961, and I had two loving parents who I very much miss today. Sadly, I lost them both tragically. I saw my mom actually physically fall apart and literally starve to death in the hospital. She was between the psychiatric hospital and a medical hospital, and she had been diagnosed with chemical imbalance, manic depression. She was also paranoid and suffered from schizophrenia. My dad was an iron worker, a very proud iron worker, and he worked on some very amazing buildings and bridges. My dad worked on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and he also worked on the World Trade Center many years earlier. And he was even featured in an article because Gay Talese was an author for the New Yorker magazine, and he actually sat and interviewed my dad when he first worked on the bridge. And then many years later he did a follow-up to his book called The Bridge, where he added another chapter or a prologue to the story. And he got in touch with some of the ironworkers that he had interviewed many years earlier and spoke to my dad about his feelings on the 9/11 tragedy in the World Trade Center when it went down, and it was very heartbreaking. And my dad shared his beliefs and said he really wasn't surprised of the collapse of the two buildings based on all of the heat generated from the planes and the fuel. But anyway, yeah, I was very proud of both my parents, my mom and my dad. I write a blog. It's called The Father's Love, My Son and Autism, which I started as a result of my father's tragic suicide, which was 4 years ago. My mom died 20 years earlier. So my dad was pretty much alone a lot, and he struggled. He missed his wife. And it was very devastating to him. It was devastating to all of us. But my dad was very loyal to mom, and he did so much for her. And seeing him alone was very sad. But that was the love of his life, and he never fell in love again, so he never dated. It was just mom. So, the things that made my dad happy was his grandchildren. I have two sisters, one with 4 kids, one with 3. And I am also married with a son. My son is 14 years old. I love my wife very much, and my son I adore. The issues he has is kind of similar to mine in ways of the way he feels. He's a depressed kid, but he's a wonderful kid. He's also very sad and isolated. He suffers from autism. He's actually considered high-functioning Asperger's, but he has poor social skills and he lacks friends, and this all winds up in him having low self-esteem, not feeling comfortable with himself, not confident, and he has a difficult time in the presence of others. And he tries too hard, and in many ways I was similar. I was very isolated. I felt cut off. I was depressed quite often, and I knew I was different. I struggled with gender dysphoria, which is a term used where your mind does not match your body, meaning my mindset was female, but my body was male. And I couldn't reconcile the two. It was very difficult for me. And I found that my only solace was when I dressed up. I was cross-dressing since the age of 4, and I cross-dressed all throughout my life. But for me, it didn't feel like cross-dressing. It just felt normal. It felt like I was dressing in the right clothes. I wore dresses and I was so happy. It just made me feel special, but it made me feel correct in how I felt. So by wearing a dress, it matched my physical outside look to my mental, emotional, and I knew that was what I was dealing with. And I started reading as a young teenager about the subject of transsexuals and men who had sex change operations and became female. And I knew at that young an age that I was in that kind of a situation. I didn't know the terms at the time, but I identified back then, though I didn't know the term, as a male to female transgender. And I never sought help. I never spoke to my parents about it. I never confided in my 2 sisters. I never confided in a friend. I just tried to deal with it as best I could on my own terms. And, I suppressed it. The times that I was happy, the times when I was happy was when I was physically dressing and living as a female in the way I presented myself. It was much harder at that young an age because, well, no, actually, it wasn't that hard because I had not gone through puberty yet. But once I went through puberty and cross-dressed, it was much more difficult because the masculinization of my body took place. And it was a very difficult time for me because I didn't feel that way. I never knew that I was going to be trapped kind of in a precarious situation where I was a male, and though I knew from the body perspective I was male, my mind, heart, and soul told me I was a female. So I knew that I was completely different from most people. Most children growing up didn't have these feelings, but I knew right away, and I knew it at a very young age. I knew at some point in my life I would have to face the fact that I was going to transition to become a woman. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, I didn't know if it was ever going to happen, but I knew deep down in my heart that I would face that reality. And here I am. I'm not a young kid anymore. I'm actually in my early 50s. I try to present as young as I can, but age does catch up with you. So, I knew I wanted to transition when I was a 16-year-old. I knew I wanted to transition when I started college. I knew I wanted to transition in my 20s. I knew I wanted to transition even as a 30-year-old, 35, 40. But things happened in my life. I went to school, and I was very preoccupied with studying. I was a mechanical engineering student, so it was very difficult. So I found myself more in the library studying than pining over my transgender situation. So in a way it was actually good. I gravitated to math and physics. I was kind of a nerdy type of kid, but I was also not given the gift of intelligence. I had to struggle for everything I learned, but I put all my devotion into it. And I learned that from actually my parents, both of them. I now remember the days when my mom would sit with me and help me do my homework, and how she sat and made sure that I understood it. And I had tutor for my math, and my very first experience in school where I knew I had the support of a teacher was in kindergarten, actually, where my kindergarten teacher, and I'll never forget her name, Mrs. Blackbear, would sit with my mom, and they would go over the math with me, and I got over the fear, and I learned math, and actually math became my favorite subject. And then I started for taking science and English, and I loved all those subjects, but math and science were my favorite. So that's why I gravitated towards engineering, and also because my dad was an iron worker. He worked, as I said, on the World Trade Center, on the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and he even worked on my high school. Right now, I started actually going to support groups. Actually, tonight, I was at the LGBT Center in New York City on West 13th Street. I think it's between 7th and 8th Avenue. And I went to the second time, actually, a male to female transgender support group. And I find it very helpful. It gives me a chance to open up. And actually there was an attorney there who I found interesting to listen to. You see, I've been struggling with being transgender all my life, basically. I knew since the age of 4. Things happened later in my life that propelled me to actually start the process of transitioning. Actually, I'm currently going to doctors at Beth Israel Medical Center as aftercare treatment for severe depression, and I hate to say it, but I also attempted suicide. I also had attempted suicide many years earlier as a teenager with trying to overdose. But recently, I've been stressed out a lot, actually, because I was working for a medical office, a medical practice with many offices, and actually I got it through the CPA firm that I used to work for. they had actually helped me get the position that I was in before I decided, or was persuaded actually, to take the position in Manhattan. Actually, I was apprehensive about changing jobs initially when I came out at work, and I had been there for almost 3 years. They were not open to the idea of me transitioning from male to female, and they had several meetings with me, and we talked, and my supervisor, who I very much appreciated and had a lot of respect for, and I still do to this day, was on the fence, and she didn't think it was good for the company or for the employees. She felt that I was placing them in an awkward situation. So, initially they were not accepting of it. But then they had a change of heart, and they said they would be willing to work with me in transitioning. The only thing they asked of me was that I transition at a slower pace. And I was already starting on female hormones, so it was hard for me to guarantee the timetable, because I wasn't, I was new to being on hormones, starting on estrogen. I started actually on my own, taking a Premarin, it's called, which is a female hormone based on estrogen, but it's extracted from, I don't know the exact way to say it, but it's extracted from the urine of horses, and they extract out estrogen. And I was doing research trying to find what kind of hormone pill I could take, but I was self-medicating, and I didn't really want to do that. I knew there were risks. So actually I started going to Callum Wood after hearing about it in a chat room. I believe it was on crossdressers.com. It was might have been in a thread actually. So what I did was I did a search on Callum Wood on the internet, and I called and arranged for an appointment, and I requested a female doctor. So I was assigned a doctor, very professional. I love her very much. Her name is Juliet, and she's been nothing but a blessing for me. And it's funny, when I first went there, on my first appointment, I had a suit and tie on, and underneath I had a dress. And that's how I always used to dress. I used to go to work with a dress on underneath my male clothing. I was desperate. I wanted to express my female gender, but I couldn't at the time. So the only way I felt comfortable was knowing at least I had the dress on. And that made me feel good. And I remember as a child sleeping under the covers wearing a dress. And it just felt natural to me. And I knew when I was 4, when I first tried on a dress, that was what I was going to deal with for the rest of my life. And I wore dresses all the time. I was a cross-dresser. And I went through those stages of guilt and purging, and, it was crazy. I purged 6 times in my life, trying to repress and deny what was truly going on with me. And in the initial stages, I kind of just tried to accept myself as a cross-dresser, not going to the transgender spectrum, trying to stay on the dressing side. But when I was a teenager, I remember going to the library and reading a lot about transsexuals. And I read about well-known transsexuals, one being the tennis player, Dr. Renee Richards. I also read about the GI, Christine Jorgensen, who was one of the first well-known transsexuals who had surgery. She went abroad to a foreign country to do the surgery, and she came back and she was beautiful. I read about Tula, a very famous model who was born male and had the sex change operation, I believe, as a teenager, as early as 18, I believe. So I knew what I was dealing with. I knew that it was more than just a cross-dressing situation. I knew I was transgender. I didn't know the term at the time, but I knew I was a girl. I always identified as a girl, and I always felt like a girl inside, in my mind, my heart and my soul. I felt female, though I knew I was born male. The term they use to describe where your mind does not match your body is gender dysphoria, or gender identity disorder, or transgender. Gender dysphoria is what is the medical terminology used for my situation. I was at odds with my physical sex. I knew I was a female. I knew it in my mind. I knew it in my heart, and I knew it in my soul. But my body was not in agreement with how I felt inside. So I was very much suffering, and I never talked to people about it. I never had a support system. I struggled with this for many, many years. And it was 4 years after my mother's death. My mother died young. She was only 50. And I remember being at the hospital. And I remember visiting with her. And I remember holding her hand. And I remember asking one time for her to just squeeze my hand, so I knew she was still there. And though she wasn't really strong, I felt her squeeze my hand, so I knew she still was there. And, I had to hold out hope that she would gain her strength back. But in my mind, I kind of knew we were going to lose her, but I wasn't sure when. And, just a few days after that incident, when I was coming home from the city, I worked as a CPA. I was working in a CPA firm in the city. I took the train home. I used to park in Belmore at my sister's house, and I was a commuter. And my brother-in-law saw me coming to my car, and he called me over. And I saw my sister at the door, and she said, "Take a seat." And she told me Mom had passed away. And I was beside myself. I was devastated. And I thought back to that day when I last saw her, and realizing that was the last time I saw her. And I just cried. I never got to tell her about my situation. I had always wanted to come out, but I was afraid. Plus my mom was ill. She was suffering from depression. She was manic depressive. She had bouts with paranoia and schizophrenia. And my dad was a strong man, and he also suffered in his life. And he dealt with many things. He dealt with alcoholism. He dealt with depression. So he was in and out of hospitals too. And, it was definitely a very difficult time for us, for the family. We struggled, my two sisters and I. My dad was a good man. He was an iron worker, and he put all his time and devotion into his job. That was his only way after dealing with my mother's tragic death. And he was a good father, and, he had to play two roles. But my two sisters were already out of the house, so it was really just me and my dad. And it was a struggle because he was depressed. He started drinking again, and, I always looked up to my dad and always had tremendous respect for him. But he battled with alcoholism too, and I knew he had to get help. So he actually went to a drug and dependency alcohol treatment facility in Rhode Island, where he spent 2 weeks, I believe. And then he went to AA meetings, and he became sober. He was clean and sober for many years, but circumstances made him go back on occasion. And sadly, we lost my dad 4 years ago. He took his life tragically one day where he went for a walk after having an argument with my sister. And my sister thought, he was just going for a walk to just try to get away. And she never saw him again. He went to the train station down her block, and he, from what I understand, he jumped in the direction of a speeding train and was propelled forward and hit the concrete barrier, and he got killed on impact. So he died in a horrible way. He had a closed casket funeral, and it was a very difficult time for me. And then I had a good friend who reached out to me, and he was the very first one to talk to me after my father's tragic death, and he helped me through a difficult time. And then sadly, 2 years later, I heard that he had passed away in his sleep, and I was in shock. My best friend, one of my best friends, 40 years old, left behind a wife and a daughter, died. And it was a very difficult time for me then. And I was in my early 50s at the time, so I started seeking therapy. And I was presented this job opportunity, as I was saying before, to work for a doctor's office. And, I was persuaded to go, and I took the position. And what happened was, after 7 months, after feeling like I was accepted there, they accepted me. I actually interviewed as a male, but I told them my situation, and they hired me as a female. But everything was in male name. But they treated me as Emily. And I was subsequently terminated. I felt that the owner didn't respect me. And I wound up in hospitals. I was in 3 hospitals, and I struggled with depression and even thoughts of suicide. So it was a real struggle for me. Wait for